Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series. It's a series where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. Individuals who have been willing to share their experiences about how it is that they gain their sense of identity and their sense of belonging. And you know what? I say this every week, and I have to always say this, that I've never, ever, ever been disappointed in the guests when they've been here. And now this guest, I have been trying to get her on the show for, I don't know, about 4 years. She is an amazing young woman. And her name is Jacqueline Darkwa. And Jacqueline is a documentary photographer. She's a filmmaker. She's a founding member of the Black Scholarship Collective. And she's also a project manager at Mission 44. Jacqueline, it's such a privilege to have you with us this afternoon. And I want to just say a big thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick off by asking you that first question, which is, can you tell me what it was or what it is that gave you your sense of identity and your sense of belonging as you were growing up?
I do have to start by just saying thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to just to be here today. We had a great conversation before we started. What gave me my first sense of identity growing up? I think it was a few different combinations. So my family are of Ghanaian heritage, so that was something that was just kind of always existing. My grandparents and you know their Ghanaian heritage and going to Ghana as a young kid, so that was like an element of my identity that it was always there, you know. And but back in the UK, we were in a predominantly white neighborhood, and kind of had that dichotomy of obviously knowing I was of African descent, knowing that I had Black family members and I was a Black person, but not necessarily seeing it in my most immediate surroundings, the ones I was in mostly. And I think outside of identity, like it tends to be just about race, but also I think, and we mentioned this when we were talking earlier this week, that I was very much a tomboy. Like my identity was like, I want to play football. I don't want to be caught in a skirt or a dress. I was not reenacting Annie with the girls on the playground. I was out there. That wasn't me. So there was an element, I think, of who I wasn't. I think I've always known who I wasn't. And that's probably given me my biggest sense of identity. And it's changed as I've gotten older and been in new spaces and redefining what identity is for me. But I think it was a combination of, obviously coming from a Black family, having loads of family in South London and seeing the way that they interacted amongst themselves when they were in more predominantly Black areas compared to where I was growing up at the time, which was a predominantly white area, predominantly white working class, burgeoning middle class in the early 2000s as well. So I think those are probably some of the most defining factors that kind of gave me a sense of who I was. And I was always very much told as a kid, Jacqueline, Hurricane Jacqueline is also what I heard. I kind of got the sense that I was a lot, and took up space. So it was just one of those things that it was also the way people referred to me as well, kind of just picking up on the small cues.
It's interesting that you started off by paying homage to your heritage, to say that of Ghanaian heritage, and so that was something which was drilled into you, or drilled. It was um embraced from a very early age, even though you were in a predominantly white area. Okay, so there was,
Yeah.
when was it that you kind of like realized there's it's one thing to kind of like know, to say you're Ghanaian, you're Black, but when did you get that kind of like sense of, people view me differently?
Mm. Ooh, good question. I think for me, probably primary school. And I always paraphrase this terribly, but that James Baldwin quote where he talks about how young Black kids don't know they're Black. At first, you just think you look like your environment, and then there becomes a moment where it's so intangible, and it's hard to articulate what triggers that kind of perception change, I guess. But I definitely say in primary school, I was the only Black girl in my year group for the majority of my time. And I think as you just get older, it's more like a process of deduction. You start to notice what's different about you compared to your peers as you get older. And that's kind of the only thing you have to justify maybe why you're being treated differently. I remember I had a headmaster who I won't name, even though I do remember her name, in primary school. And I remember my best friend at the time, because most of my best friends were white, because that's who I was friends with, that's who I had in my school. Um, the old headmaster pulled her aside and told her that she should watch out for people like me. And I was no more than like maybe 11 years old. I couldn't have been more than 11 years old because I was definitely probably in year three, maybe year five. Um, and that was one of those things where at the time I didn't really understand it. I just knew it didn't make sense.
Mhm.
And it was funny enough, it was my friend that told me afterwards. She didn't get it either. She didn't really understand, you're young kids. And I think small trips like that, it's like a weathering of a stone, it just took quite a few small incidences and just events that I was like, oh, okay, you're starting to see the cracks
Mhm.
in the way that people are being treated. And I do remember once my parents sat me and my sisters down, and I wonder if they remember this. I remember they sat us down. I couldn't tell you how old I was. And I'm going to say what I remember because I know this is not what they said, but I definitely remember essentially that conversation I think all Black parents have with their children at a certain point, which is the world is not fair.
Yeah.
You are not going to be judged on your merits. And what I remember hearing was, you're not just Black, you're Black women. This is just me and my sisters. And essentially maybe preparing or just warning us that there were going to be certain struggles and limitations that we were going to face just by virtue of being Black women. So that double-edged sword, I can't remember the term, I've heard people refer it to do like not double jeopardy, but it's like a compounding factor.
Doubly different.
Um, yeah, it was exactly. And it's one of those things that I didn't have a word for it at first. Like now, obviously, I know to refer it as like misogynoir, but at the time, I always felt like gender parity conversations, and this was probably once I was more in my adolescence and my adulthood, gender parity conversations were much more welcome. Like I
Mhm.
could talk about being a woman and I could talk about being Black, but if I wanted to bring the two into an intersection, I'd lose people.
Mhm.
And I remember that specific incident with my parents where they kind of sat us down. And I remember my interpretation of that moment was, what do you mean I can only achieve so much? Because I'm a Black woman. I just thought that was absolutely nonsense. And I now, looking back, understand what they were trying to say. But I just remember that being a really sticking point in me where and I was always the kind of person you couldn't tell me I couldn't do something.
Yeah.
So if you told me I couldn't do it, I was going to do the thing you told me not to do. So it was one of those moments where I was like, well, we'll see. So yeah, I think that's just a combination of loads of different ways that formed my sense of identity. I know this is a very long answer, but I
That's
do have to mention that. My brief time in Romania. So my dad got a job there in 2000, I always get the dates wrong, 2004, 2003. And we moved out there for a year. And if you didn't know you were Black before, you know you were Black when you moved to Romania. Because I went from Chingford to Bucharest, and like to the point where Chingford has Black people, but it's maybe not that many at that time. But like Romania, you could count the Black people that you would encounter, to the point where like we would wave at each other. We didn't know each other, but you'd wave. There was just like that nod that we do of like, okay, I see you, we're not alone. And I think Romania is also a space where I really learned what my Blackness means outside of the UK, what it
Mhm.
means just not in my bubble, in my street, in my postcode. And but also the interconnectivity between Black people who don't know each other. I think that was one thing I was exposed to.
when you say about the fact that you knew about when you got to Romania, it kind of like opened your eyes about blackness in basically in a continental setting. How can you just elaborate on that? What was it that kind of like awakened or
Mm.
was became much more tangible to you at that point?
I think it was the comparison from my primary school experience, because I was still in primary school at the time, and it was an American international school. So for like anyone that hasn't been to like an international school, it's just a general melting pot of
Mhm.
people from all across the globe. And this one in particular, again, I was the only black girl in my grade because it was an American school. I knew of the black students in the grades of either side of me. And I
Mhm.
think that speaks to that interconnectivity of like, I remember the girl that was in the grade above me because she was the only black girl in her grade. And so we had a very, on a very surface level, but we had a relationship, there was an understanding. And it was also, I mean, Romania has its own, that was like a different experience on what it means to be a racial diversity in a country like in Eastern Europe and Romania post-communism as well. So there was that kind of element. But I think going from a predominantly white area in the UK to Romania, which you can't even necessarily call predominantly white because it's just a completely different country.
Mhm.
And seeing similarities of like, you know, being the only one, what it's like when people engage with you. The staring was one thing, and that's why like I tend not to be phased by that kind of stuff because I grew up learning how to tune it out. And I think there was one of, I think we went to Transylvania for just like a family trip one time. And I remember this woman, this black woman, running up and seeing my family and hugging my mum. I remember thinking she knew my mum. She didn't know my mum. She was just so happy to see not just black people, but a black family, which I don't think she probably encountered. And they were people, most of them obviously were international. So they were maybe Americans that were working on business. And so I think that element of that expat international student, it's such a weird experience and it's such a ethnic and multicultural experience. And not a lot of people do get exposed to that because I was able to see what blackness was for different people because it wasn't just black Britishness, it was African Americans, it was Africans from from the continent who were working remotely, or not working remotely, but working internationally in a country like Romania. So the intersections of Black identity were more prevalent, whereas in where I was growing up in the UK, it was Black as a monolith, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Mhm. And I suppose based on that, especially when you were in your primary school, and we haven't gone to your secondary school yet, but in your primary school where you were the only one in your form, right? And the fact that you weren't in a predominantly black area, um, and you spoke about the interactions that you had with the other members of your family who were in predominantly black areas. How did that position itself for you? Not kind of like in terms of my blackness, as it were, but just as being. Did it make you feel I'm different or anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and again, it's like before you have the words for it and you have the context, you can only go off how you feel and how certain environments and spaces make you feel. And I definitely felt in my younger years that I wasn't really black because I wasn't having black experiences. Because when I would go to predominantly black areas, they would reference like this is going to sound, I don't know if I should say this, but I hope it's not taken the wrong way. But like you think about the rise of grime and UK music culture in the early 2000s and the late 90s, predominantly being in South London as well. I got to see my cousin specifically interaction with that compared to what we had up in Chinkford. We had Blazing Squad. Like they were very different vibes of what we were getting. So like there was an element of like that black experience that I was seeing up here was very different. And what I guess I didn't understand, and part of this maybe was the problem of the communication of the black experience, is that it is a monolith and it isn't, obviously.
Mhm.
But there was, I think, an element of like, I don't relate to certain things in the way that they do, or I don't have as much knowledge in certain spaces as my cousins and my relatives did. So it made me feel like there was something about my Black experience that wasn't true, if that makes sense. I know looking back, that's just, a combination of different factors, but I was also really conscious that like, outside of my family at that point, I didn't have Black friends
Mhm,
because I didn't go to a school where there were enough Black people to have Black friends.
mhm,
So that wasn't really until secondary school that I started to actually have Black people that I was friends with that weren't related to me.
mhm.
And what that experience did to kind of broaden my day-to-day exposure to the different kinds of the Black experience and then the intersectionality within that.
So tell me a bit about your secondary school. I know we spoke about it.
Mm.
Just sanitize.
I'll do my best to sanitize. Um, yeah, I mean, for anyone that went to my school, it was in Essex. It's a Catholic school in Essex, Woodford Green, and um, it was a weird experience because I was on the waiting list. I was just outside the catchment area, and it was one of the better schools in the area. So my parents, my mum in particular, was very eager for me to go to this school. And I remember doing the what did confirmation,
Mhm.
communion, Holy Communion. So I had to do my Holy Communion to get into the school. So there was already a sense of trying to fit the mold, if that makes sense, because most of the schools in my immediate area were non-denominational. They were all state schools, varying degrees of attainability at each of the schools. But that school in particular was one of the best and had the best reputation as a state school. Um, I always find it really interesting because Trinity is just, if I could spend 10 years studying that school, I really would. Um, it was sandwiched between a private school, a grammar school, and a state school, non-denominational. And in the immediate area of the state schools, it was one of the best performing. But then we were surrounded, our most immediate schools were private and grammar. So there was an element of elitism surrounding us that our school was, even though we knew reputationally as a state school, it was very well received. But our immediate surroundings were people that went to do an 11 plus or pay for a private school. So there were so many intersections. And I think my experience in that school was, as I mentioned, one of the first times I was able to really make strong connections with Black people that weren't related to me. So they come from different walks of life, different parts of London. Because where my school was on the border of Essex, East London, and like Ilford, Barkingside. So you had people coming from all sorts of walks of life into this school for 7 years and at a Catholic school on top of that. So then you have Catholicism and then, the Christianity and, think what you may on that front. And I remember I didn't want to go to that school because I had to wear a skirt. And my mum very much informed me that was not going to be a deciding factor. She'd already enrolled me, the uniform had already been bought. But I think my school experience it was very interesting. It's one of those things that I do look back on fondly because great friends, some great experiences and just youth in general, I think, more broadly. But, there were definitely, as I'm sure most schools in the UK, we had our issues with racial equity, with certain perceptions, like it wasn't a segregated school, but because it was a predominantly white school as well, there was a clustering of Black identity. So we had a group that was referred to as the Black Boys, which was probably maybe no more than 20 to 30. Thinking about my year group being almost 240 up to 300, it's not a massive amount, but again, you kind of group people together, you turn them into a monolith, and especially with Black culture, people tend to extrapolate that kind of stuff. So um, it was an interesting experience, and I think it's unfortunately, and I think this is the case of just most racial experiences in the UK, they're quite insidious.
Mhm.
So it's hard to pinpoint specific experiences unless, unfortunately, you've experienced a singular event where you can point to some of the issues that may have led to certain things like as context. One example I can definitely give is we hats were banned. I can't remember what they used in 8 or year 9. They banned hats because they induced gang culture.
No,
Oh no.
I
Can you hear
think,
me?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the signal dropped off, but you're back. Can you hear me?
Can you shut the door, please? Better?
Yep, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think year eight, year nine, they banned hats from the school because they induced gang culture, which even at that age, yeah, Wayne, there were so many rules came out. Girls weren't allowed to wear shiny shoes because people could look up your skirt. Not don't look up people's skirts, just don't wear pattern shoes. Yeah, there was a lot of yeah, so that's another we talked about this for a while on Wednesday. Um, but yeah, like you weren't, I remember distinctly there was a point, and I don't remember what was going on in the world around this time. But I remember they banned hats because it induced gang culture. And again, we were in Woodford Green. Wasn't a lot of gang culture in Woodford Green. Don't know if anyone knows that side of Essex too well. But I remember I had a neon purple beanie hat, and I remember my teacher, because we had to commute between sites, and I remember him seeing it and going, "Jacqueline, hats are banned." I just remember thinking, what gang reps a neon purple beanie hat? Like, whose colours am I repping? Walking between the, and there was a lot of like just really in underhand ways where that messaging, like, and I know specifically for the black boys at that school, there were some incidences where I think it was like hair was the big thing you find in a lot of schools that they use to police identity. So I don't think you could have a fade. Essentially, you couldn't have your hair too short, you couldn't have your hair too long. And so there was just small ways that your identity was being reminded that it wasn't appropriate or it wasn't conducive to a professional, environment.
Yeah.
And then you add like Eurocentric beauty standards were at a height at that point because you kind of had the advent of social media and Instagram and Facebook were coming up. But then you also had like The Only Way is Essex was probably the highest charting show on at that time. So Fake Tan Central, Eurocentric beauty standards kind of ruled what people's idea of what looking good looked like. And more so, I'd say, for obviously young girls at that time, it's a bit more compounded because that's the messaging you're consistently getting more and more. Um, and so I think from an identity perspective, it was a very interesting school to go to. But
Mhm.
I was really lucky that like the friendships that I had and the ability, the space that I had to make genuine friendships with people that looked like me and learn more about their experiences and just at that school there was a lot of nonsense.
So tell me,
Um,
sorry.
we were yeah. No, no.
No, I was gonna ask, so you had those friendship groups. I'm assuming because of the nature of the school, that it was viewed as a good school, as it were, that all of you had
Mhm.
aspirations to do well. Was that aspiration
Mhm.
encouraged, channeled, were you provided with the support other than them telling you you can't wear your bright purple neon hat? Did they encourage you to say, you know what, you guys can achieve whatever you want to achieve? Was that the your experience going through secondary school?
Yes and no. And I think I can only speak to this specific school, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is evident in quite a few schools where it was like, if you could bring up their average grades, they would 100% push you. If you could increase their percentage of A's to A stars, and you could go on to Oxbridge, if they got a feeling that that was something you were capable of, regardless of your background, they would push you in that direction. Obviously, it was very much skewed towards non-Black students
Mhm.
and a lot of basically no students of color because the Black students weren't the only students of color at that school. You had people from, South Asian, East Asian backgrounds as well. And so I think in terms of like encouraging, um, it was, you were lucky if you got a teacher. I think this very much depended on who was advocating for you in certain spaces.
Mhm.
Um, because I know, especially my maths A level, there was one student in particular who I didn't see it myself, but it wasn't until afterwards when they passed their A-level maths, they wrote an email to a teacher and basically told them, you spent a year telling me I wouldn't amount to much and wouldn't really, A-level maths wouldn't be a good option for him. And he went on to get an A star. And yeah, an A-level maths. Like I did not get an A star. I can't remember what I got in A-level maths. Like, I still have nightmares about that C4 exam. I'm not gonna lie. Um, uh, but like that was the kind of stuff where I think, and I find this in all walks of life, and especially in any kind of space where there's like a commitment to inclusion or belonging or anything of that kind where it's performative,
Mhm.
where it's like if you look like the kind of person they want, the type of person they are willing to help, then you'll get the help.
Yeah.
If you have any kind of behavioral issue, it's a no-no, whether that's diagnosed or undiagnosed. If you don't talk the right way, that's another one. And so I definitely saw the way some of my peers were being treated because maybe they weren't as outspoken, or whatever it was. I saw certain markers being used to hold them back. It never made sense to me. It's not something that since I got older and I started working in like the third sector and working in these spaces that I saw it from the other side. Still disagree with it. It's not saying that I saw the side and
Mhm.
started to see where people were coming from. I still think it's wrong. But it was like elements of that. And I've always been as I mentioned, a bit of a rebel rouser. I don't like bullies. It's also another thing. So I have been known to challenge a teacher or two. I had one teacher in particular, in year 8, who, again, I'm not going to name him. But this man knows who I'm talking about. And he was our music teacher. And I remember he was also a form tutor. And he essentially, before a music exam, and it was year 8, so it wasn't like it counted for anything, he basically told us that we wouldn't pass. He called us musically, I won't use the slur, but musically R word. That's how he'd even described our class to other classes. And he went around the classroom once and intentionally picked the biggest students in the room and asked them how much they weighed so he could talk about how much he could bench press them.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah. Yeah, year 8, we were 13. And I just remember, oh, I'm surprised. And we got put on an academic report after this, by the way, because we reported him and we got in trouble. But I remember challenging him on the spot. I just said, and this was in the same conversation when he was like, you guys aren't going to do well on this exam, da da da. And I was like, don't you think you should be more encouraging? Don't you? How is that supposed to be motivating? Well, it's meant to motivate you to be better. How is telling us that we're
Yeah.
poop, I'm not going to
Yeah.
swear,
Yeah.
um, is how that's supposed to be encouraging. And I remember there was a massive back and forth between him and my class and myself. And yeah, there was a lot of small incidents like that. And that is kind of where I've always come from my perspective of like, I don't like bullies. I don't like people picking on someone the weakest in the room just because they can get away with it, or people making someone else feel small so they can feel big. And maybe that's because of my experiences in primary school, where there were definitely times where I felt like I was the easy one to get at because I was the only Black girl, if that made sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I was not going to have it at my big grown age of 13. And so I think kind of tying back to that element of identity, it was like, I just was always prepared to challenge something if it was wrong. Speaking truth to power is one of those things I've always wanted to do. And it could be just because of the stuff that I used to watch as well, like the movies I looked up to and some of the things that I was exposed to in like, reading and movies and that kind of stuff. But yeah, that school experience definitely taught me the meaning of advocacy, the meaning of self-determination. Because I was lucky, I had some good teachers that really fought for me, and were really encouraging of me. But I knew I wasn't like I don't know how to describe it, but like I knew that wasn't the same experience every other Black student at that school was getting.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it's because I spoke the right kind of way and I handled myself the right kind of way that they thought she was worth helping. Um, but yeah, kind of just there was so many things about that school experience.
Listen, I remember when we were discussing it, and I said,
Yes.
just write the book, write the book, write the book, write the book. This is
Oh
not
God.
fiction. This is a real story.
Very, very real. But yeah, no, it was good. You take the good with the bad. I think that's the case as anyone does.
So, so you went through school and you went to university. Clearly, your parents, from a very early outset, they were definitely um, encouraging
Mm.
education. It
Oh
wasn't
yeah.
an option. It wasn't an option. Right?
Not not even slightly. And I think we spoke about this briefly, and I think you'll find this a lot in any kind of literature that reviews specifically African perceptions of social mobility and the vehicles to get there, but also in the Black middle class, like with Professor Rollock's work.
Mhm,
Um, that kind of social capital, and I don't know if it's just I have not personally myself done any research into this, but I don't know if it has to do with the role colonialism played embedded within West African countries.
mhm,
Um, and the fact that you had a generation around the 40s to 60s, if not the 70s, of people from the colonies going to study abroad.
mhm,
Um, and so from my grandparents, both my maternal and my paternal and maternal and paternal grandparents, education was massive. Like my dad's dad always wanted a doctor in the family, bone doctor specifically, because that's where the money is. That's what he used to say. And Oxford or Cambridge, like that was the bar.
yeah.
Don't think he expected me to go to Brighton. But it was that was just like a very clear messaging, and I get it. Like I understand where that comes from, and I'm a great believer in that as well. That like knowledge is power, and I think I heard that maybe one too many times when I was young, because I genuinely believed that
Mhm,
the more I learned, the more powerful I could become.
yeah.
And, power to me at 5 years old was like Power Rangers. It was literal power. So I thought if I could, like Dexter's Laboratory, I wanted my dad to build. We had this cupboard under the stairs in the garage. And I remember wanting him to build me a laboratory like Dexter's Laboratory. I had it all in my head. There was like a tunnel, and then I'd have like my equipment. So my frame of reference for a lot of this stuff was very heavily like influenced by the stuff I was watching essentially. And so education was always like seen as the way to lift oneself up,
Mhm,
and to also protect yourself against oppression to some extent, right? And I think everyone kind of has that idea. I think it's unique to West Africans or Africans more broadly. You see it in a lot of Black liberatory practices that I can't remember. I've been reading a lot recently, but I think it was Dubois who essentially mentions that like education is the best thing that Black people can do. It should be the biggest thing that we should prioritize. And this obviously Reconstruction America at times, there's a different context, but it was a very strong message that the higher you can go within your education, the better. And both my parents had degrees, they met at uni. And I think also because they both studied at university in Ghana,
mhm,
post-independence under Kwame Nkrumah's university. So there's an element of Ghana's specific journey with education,
mhm,
and post-independence, the influence of scientific and technological education being a way to empower a new generation and by proxy a country. And you see that a lot around that kind of independence, civil rights movement, that there was a massive pivot towards education. So I think taking into account the era my parents grew up in, I mean, education, I'm pretty sure it was free for them to go to university at that time. And it was where most of my aunties and uncles all met. So like a lot of my extended family and relatives all know Tech, which was the uni in Ghana. It's a uni I wish I went to. I've been to that campus so many times. It's like right next to my grandma's house in Ghana. We go and buy watch from there when we go to visit Ghana. I know the campus scarily well considering I've not been there. But like that interest in education as a vehicle for change has been kind of just like running through both sides of my family because they come from very humble backgrounds, like farming, and like my grandma used to be a market woman, and then ran her own distribution company. My dad's dad was also a farmer, but also ended up running the Kumasi railways back in the 20th century. And yeah, it was just understanding how much education made a difference. And I don't know if it's because prior to that, formal education just wasn't a thing in most of those colonies.
Mm.
And then you kind of had that liberation where you could choose what you wanted to go study. It wasn't just the missionaries building schools and teaching you about Jesus. There was an opportunity to go learn more broadly. And so it's something I've always taken very seriously. And I just love learning. I've always been super curious. I remember back in the days when you had the encyclopedia and I'd ask mom a question and she said, go check the encyclopedia. And if it wasn't in the encyclopedia, that was it. Like there was no Google. So if I think it was encyclopedia or ask your teacher, like those were your options. If
Yeah.
you did not get an answer from either of those, it was just a mystery.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, to this day, I still go on a Wikipedia binge every once in a while. I love my documentaries, which is probably why I ended up in the field that I am in that space, just because learning. And for me, it's just being able to understand the big picture,
Hmm.
understand why things are the way they are, how they got there, and then how to dismantle them.
Hmm.
Um, so I've always really loved that. And I think that's one of the things that I loved with the Black Scholarship Collective and the work that we've been doing there, which was just really understanding and celebrating knowledge for knowledge's sake. Because
Hmm.
I think the messaging that you found in some of the early generations was purely education as a means to an end.
Hmm.
It's a means to which improve your livelihood, increase generational wealth and experiences and all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't like my granddad didn't want me to get a PhD for getting a PhD. He wanted me
Hmm.
to become a medical doctor.
Hmm.
Um, and not that that's a bad thing, but there's an element of like, why can't we just learn for learning's sake? Why can't we just celebrate wanting to dedicate time and resources to learning as much about a subject as possible? And it's sad because you think about the history of education and knowledge specifically within the African context and some of the world used to come to Africa to study if you think about pre-colonial times and that understanding that just knowledge and records of history and just understanding the world is a beautiful thing and it's a great privilege. Is something I see somewhat returning. I would love to see more of that interconnectivity across the board. Um, but it's one thing that in my family, it's just kind of always been a thing. And I think it doesn't always have to be now in these days and age, like a university degree. It can just be where are you utilizing your curiosity? Are you reading a book about something you didn't know about? Are you watching a YouTube video about a random thought you had the other day?
So let me just make sure I'm hearing this right. Are you saying that, you know what, within my family, education was truly valued? That I'm clear about that. But are you kind of like going from that point of view of education as a means to an end, as opposed to learning as a means to satisfy your curiosity? And are the two mutually, are they dif different, or can they be merged into one? So for example, being able to, for some people, right, they are studying but they're able to, or they're doing jobs. So if you do a PhD in a particular area and it's an area of your interest, then it's almost not, I'm not just doing this because I need a job. I'm doing this out of my curiosity, which just happens to mean that I can have a job at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really sad that for the most part in the education system, at least in the UK, the two very rarely come together.
Yeah.
I would say the first time those two ideas of, a means to an end to education, but also learning out of passion, only came when I did my master's, which was really sad because I didn't have to do a master's. I chose to do a master's, chose
Mhm.
to do Imperial, as you know. Um, and I did mine in science communication specifically. And what I loved about that, and they were very encouraging, was that I could intersect my identity and whatever that meant at that time into my work. So it meant that a lot of the coursework pieces that I did were specifically looking at the intersection of race, gender, culture, and science. So I got to do a coursework piece on the accessibility of science, and I talked about the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks
Mhm.
and the role, the historic role that Black bodies have played in scientific research. I did several others. I think maybe bar one or two pieces of coursework I mentioned I somehow found a way because it was an interest to me and it was one thing that my thesis specifically, which looked at, if I can remember the title, it was The Negro Scientist, named after Du Bois' 1939 essay, I believe. Um, a quasi-ethnographic study on the perceptions and attainment of STEM PhDs for Black British students, something along those lines. And it was essentially just looking at Black PhD experiences in the UK for STEM specifically. And I don't remember exactly how I came across taking that subject. I remember was doing some research on Du Bois and coming across it and just finding that essay. But that was the first time I ever did an extended piece of research in something that I was one, passionate about, curious about. And at that time, D&I was not a field, like in the
Mhm.
UK, that's for certain. This
Mhm.
was 2019. It was before COVID, it was before Black Lives Matter. And I remember there was some hesitation towards me doing a thesis that looked at that because at that point it felt like pigeonholing. Like
Mhm.
you'll become the Black girl that talks about Black things. I just didn't see an issue with that. Like up until this point, Angela Davis had been my background on my phone for years now. So like that wasn't like I wasn't that didn't stop me. I just wanted to do it and I was really passionate about it. And I ended up doing the thesis. I loved it. It was hard, but it was because I was passionate about it that I kept going. And I'm my own most critic. Like I always set the bar very high for myself. And I think there was an element of pushing myself with that. And there was one thing that I mean, I'm very proud of that piece of work because what it's eventually led on to, what I didn't know at the time,
Yeah.
was obviously the Black Scholarship Collective and kind of laying that groundwork for myself. But I remember after we submitted our thesis, because our unit had like a radio station and they did a piece on people just talking about their thesis and how they found it. And I remember in the student union, probably with a drink in my hand, was like, for me, the thing that I learned was I learned an entire new breadth of language to describe my experiences, not just as a Black person in academia, but just as a Black person, period. So, like, learning about critical race theory was mind blowing. Like, it was absolutely mind blowing and kind of coming from my perspective of like understanding that bigger picture. So, being able to look at like Brown versus Board and the United States and the desegregation of schools and interest convergence as one of those principles of like essentially real change doesn't happen until it coincides with a vested interest of the oppressing mass.
Mhm.
So in this case, Brown versus Board being that the US's stance on segregation was hurting their international image as a liberatory country going into Vietnam and all these countries fighting for democracy, but meanwhile, Black people have to drink out of fountains at the back. So it's very well documented that the Supreme Court was lightly hint suggested to passing Brown versus Board in favor of desegregating the United States in order to help the US's image. And that's not to undermine desegregation or the work that was done to desegregate the United States, but for me, it put into context some of the intangible things because desegregation happened, but then look what followed it, you know? So just to think that certain things only happen because of altruism, and now I do work in D&I full time, and for me, And I'm very grateful that I got to have this kind of resolution and reflection pre Black Lives Matter. Because I think that was, I know quite a few people where that reckoning happened at that time, and it was very overwhelming. But because of my thesis and because of the work I'd done, I'd kind of come to that conclusion before the rest of the world had in a lot of ways. And it was a protective layer for me personally, because it meant I wasn't as shocked by some of the things. I can just understand the bigger picture and the role that it played. Um, but it was one of those things where through my thesis, understanding critical race theory, reading other people's work in this space, understanding the role that I play, the small role
Mhm.
I play in this overarching mission. One gives me like solace that I'm not alone in this journey, and that I am motivated to keep going. And more recently, I've been reflecting on Martin Luther King's quote. I hope I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't know exactly, but essentially that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Mhm.
And in that fight for equity and equality, I think there's different stages. I think people call it the red, black, green. So like you're angry, the rage, then you're black, you're pro-black, everything's black. You got the fist earrings, you got everything, the shikis on lock, like and then you get green where you kind of mellow out and you kind of understand the bigger purpose and the role that you play in it. And I'm really thankful. I definitely flip between the two, but I feel like I'm firmly on the other side of like that green of like I've had the rage,
Mhm.
I've had the anger. I'm still very pro-black. Like you just won't find that anywhere else. But there's this thing of like, and I've taken solace in that basically marrying this desire to see change now and go for generations. People have said, I'm doing it for my grandkids. But at what point, I'm the grandkids. If you think about it that way, I'm the grandkids of the civil
Mhm.
rights movement, and it's still not here.
Mhm.
So, if we keep saying tomorrow, 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 at what point will it be done? And then there's the other side of understanding that the world didn't end up this way overnight. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an accident, it was very much intentional. And that's where that quote from Martin Luther King has been very comforting for me
Yeah.
in terms of understanding literally the moral arc of the universe is long. And that's one thing I just have to remind myself. It's a long journey. Yes, I would love to see some changes in my lifetime, and some changes have happened in our lifetimes that we would not have expected to see. I do take solace in that, but also understanding that as much as I may want it, there are things that I'm not going to see in my lifetime. But I do think the role that each of us play right now could set the foundation for what that future looks like. And that is personally for me what I take the solace in and I find my comfort in and I draw my strength from. And yeah, that changes. Some days you just want to scream. So there's a balance.
I'm gonna normally I'd open up for questions, but there's a couple of things which I still want to investigate before I'd open the question in. Right. There's the issue about your filmmaking, right? But
Mhm.
there's also the issue about the role that you play at Mission 44. There's three things actually. And you briefly mentioned about the Black Scholarship Collective, right? So let's go with the Black Scholarship Collective first. What is it? What have you done? How did you help to found it? And then we'll go on to Mission 44, and then we'll do the your filmmaking and the artistic side of you. So, what is the Black um collective scholarship collective? I should know it better.
Yeah, you should because you came up with a name.
I know.
Um, the Black Scholarship Collective is a collect. I love that name personally because it is just like it does what it says on the tin. Like it is a Black collective about scholarship and education and what that means. It was born out of a lot of the frustrations in 2020, where there was a lot of institutions putting call outs. They realized that they have a role to play in systemic racism, I guess, and wanted people to respond to proposals on how to address it. So quite a few universities did it across the board, if not all of them. Um, And I think at first we were originally coming together to think about responding to a specific proposal. And I think after a few meetings, we realized that wasn't the best fit for what we wanted to do. We had ambitions bigger than that.
Mhm.
And I don't think we knew exactly what that was. Um, I really don't know how we got to where we did, to be perfectly honest. But I think there was an interest in capturing storytelling. And I do think, kind of harking back to critical race theory, like one of those principles is counter narrative. It is actually about centering Black experiences and Black storytelling and being really unapologetically about it and putting it in front and center. And so I think there was an element of like, we just want to tell our stories. We don't want to tell the universities how they've wronged us, what they could do better. Because at this point, we all knew there'd been a dozen white papers, race equality charter's been out, so many commitments, all the statements, all the black squares you could think of. But still nothing was changing. Like the problem was still the problem. And I think we came together because we wanted to specifically work within the Black community. We didn't want this to be an initiative a university could own, but it wasn't really embedded within Black communities outside of academia. Because one of the things that we realized is it's a really isolating experience to go through the highest levels of academia as a Black person, not just because you might be the only one, but also because your own family might not be aware of what that real experience is like. It can be very much romanticized. So it's really difficult to burst people's bubbles that you're really struggling at this level. And so it's one of those things where we were just really committed to dedicating some really strong storytelling elements. And I remember we used to meet up bi-weekly. I remember because I hated my job at the time. And I was the only Black woman in the entire company. I hated going on our town hall Zooms and being able to jump on a Zoom with 6 other Black faces and we could just be ourselves. And this was during Black Lives Matter. So it was really hard at that time to just exist. And I just remember after the first two, I was like, I'm going to keep coming to these meetings until they kick me out. I do not have a PhD, but I just wanted to be a part of something. And I was just so in awe of the work people had been doing to date, like yourself, William Deshane, and Medina, and just the commitment and the amount of learning that I did on those calls. I continue to learn from everybody every time we meet up. And we decided, okay, we're going to put a call out on Twitter. We're just going to ask people if they want to contribute, they can contribute. And then we ended up with 28 essays, I believe, from Black PhD students of past and present, varying disciplines, not related to STEM specifically, just talking about their experiences. And it was such an open call because we didn't specify what we were looking for. We just said, we want to hear what you want to tell us. And it snowballed into a book and then a publishing deal. And it's been like it's 4 years. It's crazy. It's absolute. When we met up last time, we were like, I can't believe it's, this thing that we started with no expectations. We had ambitions, but we didn't know where it would go. And it was just, it was a beautiful experience. And it's one of those things that like I have to remind myself I'm a part of, because it's so easy to get caught up in all the other things we're not doing in life and all the unread emails and text messages. And then I have to go, I am publishing a book this year. Let me give myself some slack. And I think that collective element is also really important because that's one thing I know we've been thinking about. Okay, no, but how do we actually bring people together on this journey? How do we meaningfully engage with young Black kids at a Saturday school in some town in London or in Edinburgh or in the Midlands? How do we let them know that this exists? How do we empower their parents and their community to encourage them to pursue this? And how do we also help people that are in it right now? And if the universities and the institutions want to adjust, they're free to do that. They can use this book as a guide, but there is enough work out there and enough literature out there that lays it out very clearly what steps could be taken. And we just didn't want to add to the noise to the university. And it's been absolutely beautiful. And I wasn't say terrified, but maybe I'm a bit terrified. That it's out this year, and we've got the launch that we're putting together, and we have a cover. Like, my hands are on the cover. It's wild.
Listen, you guys see it in a minute, so don't worry.
It's wild. It's so exhilarating, and I think because we're kind of at the in-between stage, right? Of like, it's kind of done, but it's not out. So it's like, I feel like once we're at that page where it's like it's out and it's there and we can look at it, I think I already feel proud. I feel incredibly proud of what we've done. I feel incredibly proud of the contributors for trusting us and being patient with us on this journey, and even the role that Bristol Policy Press has played in supporting us in this journey. And I'm just excited to have the book out. I think that's it. I'm just really, I want the book, and then I also want to start doing what we want to do next too, because that's also one thing. It's like we're very much like, okay, the book's done. What's next?
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Right. I'm gonna push us very quickly.
Yes, go for it.
Mission 44.
So I am a partnerships manager at Mission 44. So I manage the relationships with our funded partners. Mission 44 was testing my introductions. Mission 44 was founded by Sir Lewis Hamilton, Formula One racing driver, 7-time world championship winning. And he essentially, after a decade in the sport, realized that the diversity had not increased. And this is both not necessarily related to the drivers, but in the pit lanes and the crews and the factories, and wanted to put his money where his mouth is and invest in actually driving change in the motorsport industry. And specifically within the motorsport industry, it is, and this was much to my, I did not know this at the time when I was applying, motorsport industry holds some of I think the R&D budget for the motorsport industry is comparable to Big Pharma. Wow. So they spend just as much money, if not more, as pharma in R&D. It's insane. So if you think about everything from data management, or data technology. So I don't know if anyone's obviously an F1 fan, but the cars are very electrical. There's a lot of data points. They monitor each of those data points, but getting the data from that car that's going around a track with 1,000 other stuff going on, but getting that back to the garage so the team can analyze it. There's a team that specifically look at data transformation. And I want to believe, I could get it wrong, but like if you think about 5G and Wi-Fi 6, a lot of that R&D elements start in industries like motorsport because they have the funds to invest in research, stuff like that. Then you have ventilators. So I think during the pandemic, quite a few of the factories that would do the breathing apparatus for the drivers pivoted towards making ventilators. You have sustainable fuels, materials, there is a perception that Formula One is a gas guzzling sport, and I think I understand that, and I thought that myself. I do have to hold my hands up. Any kind of big traveling circus is going to have a high carbon footprint, that's expected. But the cars themselves are some of the most sustainable, efficient cars in the world, because that's technology at work. That's, how little, because I think with Formula One cars, the more weight you put on the car, obviously the slower you go. So can you get a fuel that you use less of, but does more? So that's where it can be a bit more sustainable. They tend to be hybrid as well. So they're not just run off fuel. So you have so many industries intersecting with motorsport, and it's really just a microcosm for some of the greatest challenges facing humanity. If you think about climate change, fuel, material sciences, rare earth minerals, we look at what's going on in Congo and Central African Republic and the mining. So it's like, what could be done to improve the diversity within motorsport as in like a knock-on effect of increasing diversity in some of these really high level industries, and understanding that most of those companies that supply Formula One and other motorsport series do other things. So you might have some that are sustainable fuel supplier for an F1 team. but they generally run within the sustainable fuel ecosystem and industry. So there's more opportunities for other wider careers. And if you can get something like motorsport to increase its diversity and retention and inclusivity and belonging for diverse groups, whether that's young or old, that's something you can map
Yeah.
and iterate across, wider industries and taking that as a microcosm for change. But also specifically looking at some of the innovation that comes out of motorsport as an industry. If you can get more diversity with that innovation at that point specifically, the limitations are completely removed if you think about getting more diverse thinking in innovation, because you have people that are solving problems other people didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
So that's essentially like just generally motorsport, and my role within that specifically being that we're a grant funder is funding organizations that work towards that kind of work where they increase equity, not specifically always within motorsport, but STEM more broadly. So whether that's young girls and women, racialized minorities, socially mobile young people, and just creating more opportunities for those of them that want to get into the industry to be able to actually build a career. So for anyone interested, I definitely recommend reading the Hamilton Commission, which was the kind of brainchild before Mission 44, where they kind of took a snapshot of the motorsport industry. And yeah, I mean, excuse me. I really love it there. I really
So,
do. It's great. It's just, can you hear me?
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I love the work. The scholarships that they run that help young people get into motorsport related careers are amazing. And it's just a very brave and innovative organization that is constantly thinking about ways to change the system and be a part of the change, not just prescribe it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Listen, we are out of time, right? But I have to ask you my two final questions,
Go ahead.
right? So these two final questions are, the first of them is, what advice would you give to your younger self? You can choose which younger self, right? Right. What advice would you give to them? And what do you think that that youngest person now looking at you would say, wow?
Um, Advice to my younger self, different versions. I think different advice for different versions of myself. But I think probably one overarching piece of advice for anyone, and that could be for me yesterday, to be perfectly honest, is just like have faith that it will work out,
Mhm.
that I can get very anxious when I don't know what's coming. And so there's an element of trusting that I'm doing everything I can,
Mhm.
and the cards will fall where they may, and all I really have control over is how I interact with the world and how I choose to grow and develop, um and stay true to myself, I think, is the one thing. I've done that a lot, mostly because I think it is like a default defense mechanism.
Mhm.
I just default to being 100% me,
Mhm.
which isn't always amazing, but we do what we can. But I think, yeah, just stay true to yourself and know that if you do, things that are for you will find you, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah. And what do you think that they
Oh,
would say? Wow.
what would they say? Wow. I'm going to be very kind to myself and say a few things. I definitely think that the Black PhD experience, the Black Scholarship Collective book, I didn't have author on the list of things.
I know, I know.
um, I had Prime Minister, astronaut, movie star. Author wasn't on there. Maybe I was aiming too low. So I think that's one. And I think specifically wow, because that is not something I did in silo. It's not something I did by myself. And that's one thing I know I've always definitely wanted as I've gotten older. And that maybe speaks back to that kind of sense of identity I had as a young child, which is like community,
Mm.
bringing that element of a collective together and that shared mission and goal and putting something out in the world that embodies that.
Mm.
Um, I think she would my younger self would probably be shocked to know that I do write. I do actually do creative work, which was something she thought was very unachievable back then. So one thing I try to remind myself of as frequently as I can is like, I just didn't think this was possible for myself.
Mhm.
And that caused a whole other bunch of issues for me because felt like I wasn't living my full truth. But I think for me, being able to know that actually I also didn't have to choose. I didn't have to choose between science and creative because a lot of the reasons why I've ended up where I am and the opportunities that have been provided or doors that have been open have been because I stayed true to myself. Because I did the undergrad in biomed, I did the masters in science, but then I would write for Galdem and then I would do my pieces and I would take my camera out and, I hosted an exhibition for my birthday last year because I just wanted to. And I wanted to celebrate that side of myself. So I didn't want to wait for someone else's validation. So I think it's not just the act of doing it that I'm most proud of myself for, but also that I try as hard as it's not always easy. There are good days and bad days, but I try to celebrate that about myself as much as possible and realize had I given into fear, I wouldn't be in a place where I'd have a book coming out with the Black Scholarship Collective. Like, I'm not saying the book wouldn't come out. It might just be that my name would be nowhere near it because that wasn't the path that I let myself take. So I think those are some of the things that if she were to be here, she probably would be like, oh, kind of cool. Which I hope so anyway. Kids are very hard to please.
No, that's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And I just want to say a really big thank you for being so honest, right? And open about your experience and sharing it with us because yeah, we've sat together on many a Sunday. We've spoken together on many a Sunday, and you know, sometimes we're in the same room, but yet we don't know what it is that helps to give each other our sense of who we are. And sometimes it doesn't matter because
Yeah.
you know that there's something which connects us. So it's really beautiful hearing um hearing your story, your identity story today. So what
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna do is just really, there's more to come. I know that there's more to come. So much more to come. All right. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just share what's next week, and I'm gonna give a little bit of a promo
Mhm.
for us going forward. So let me just quickly share with everyone. Where is it? Sorry. I that one. Okay. So next week we're going to have a lady, um, Dr. Bakal Gupta, and she is the co-founder and CEO of Deliver Biosciences. And I had the privilege of meeting her a few weeks ago, and she has an amazing story as well. And if you have missed any of the previous episodes of Belonging, please go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO, and you'll be able to hear this and many other stories about how people have gained their sense of identity and belonging. And this is what I've been waiting to present because, as you can see, here's Jacqueline, myself, William, Deshane, Medina, and Jason. And between us, we have come up with this, and these are Jacqueline's hands, right? Right, in the Black PhD experience, stories of strength, courage, and wisdom. It's a labor of love, but we know that it's going to make an impact. And it was part of the Black Scholarship Collective, and the book is going to be available from September. So if you want to pre-order, then scan this QR code and it will take you to the site. But it's about sharing that experience. It really has been about understanding that experience. If you don't know about what it's like to go through that PhD process, then this will give you some valuable insight and looking at it from a Black lens. Okay. There are many crossovers, but I think it's about time the world understood what it looks like for Black British students to go through PhDs. It's a major achievement. And I just want to say another big thank you to all of our guests who have shared their experiences, because without them, belonging wouldn't be where it is today. It's 4 years old. It's done almost 200 guests, and none of that would have happened without the support of so many wonderful people who have shared how they have gained their sense of belonging. So until next week, please make somebody feel as though they belong whilst you gain your sense of belonging. Okay. Thank you, and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.